She moved into the neighborhood quietly, with only a few boxes and a small car to bring her things. No one really noticed her at first. She was polite when she waved to the neighbors and smiled at the kids who played outside, but mostly she kept to herself. It wasn't that she disliked people or wanted to be alone. She just liked things to be calm, simple, and peaceful. She had a small home that needed attention, and she preferred to spend her evenings organizing, cleaning, and reading quietly. That was her life, simple and ordinary, till she started noticing things that didn't feel right. At first, it was little things. A door left slightly open when she knew she had shut it. A garden tool moved from where she remembered putting it. And sometimes the faint sound of someone walking around outside her home when she was sure she was alone. She told herself it was probably her imagination. Living alone made your mind play tricks on you, she reasoned. She tried to ignore it, telling herself she would notice patterns only if she was overthinking. But the unease grew. A few neighbors began making comments, casual and harmless on the surface. But there was something under their words that didn't sit right. They said she was lucky to have moved into such a quiet area, hinting that not everyone fit in or lasted here long. She smiled politely, nodded, and kept walking, but the tone in their voices suggested they believed she wouldn't last either. It was subtle, but it was there. She felt the eyes on her sometimes, especially when she walked to the mailbox or brought in groceries. She couldn't see faces clearly from a distance, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Her first real encounter was unexpected. She was watering the small garden in front of her home when a neighbor she had never really spoken to walked by. The neighbor smiled too broadly, too falsely, and said something like, "I hope you're not too scared to stay here." Some people can be difficult. She forced a laugh, tried to act casual, but inside a chill ran down her spine. She had no idea what the neighbor meant, but the way it was said made it clear that it wasn't the first time this had happened. Someone was testing her, watching how she reacted. That night, she tried to shake it off. She double-checked the locks, made sure every window was closed, and even put a chair against the door, just in case. She had never done this before. She wasn't paranoid by nature, but the small, unsettling incidents kept adding up. Every creak in the house sounded louder, every shadow longer. She told herself she would call someone if things escalated, but she didn't know who to call. The police might not take her seriously and friends were far away. She was mostly on her own. A week passed, and the small incidents became more noticeable. Her mail had been tampered with. A note that simply said, "Not for long," was left on the doorstep. She didn't understand who would do this, or why. Fear and confusion mixed inside her, but she refused to let panic take control. She decided to stay calm, knowing that reacting emotionally would give power to whoever was trying to scare her. Still, sleep became harder. Every little sound at night made her heart race. She kept a flashlight near her bed and made sure her phone was within reach. The quiet moments she once loved now felt heavy and tense. She confided in a friend over the phone. Describing the incidents without exaggeration, the friend listened and suggested keeping a record of everything, no matter how small, so she could understand if there was a pattern or a person behind it. She started writing down times, sounds, and any unusual encounters. She noticed that many things happened in the evening, especially when the streetlights came on and the neighborhood seemed calm. It wasn't random. Someone was deliberately creating discomfort, testing her resolve. Her confidence began to waver, but she refused to show fear. Each morning, she walked to the corner store, bought groceries, and returned with her head held high, acting as if nothing was wrong. Inside, she felt the tension, but she knew showing weakness would only encourage those who wanted to intimidate her. Still, every glance from a passing neighbor, every whisper, every shadow felt heavier. She learned to be alert, to notice small changes in the environment, and to anticipate the unexpected. Then came the night that changed everything. She was sitting in her living room, reading quietly, when she heard footsteps on the porch. She froze. Her mind raced, thinking of all the possible explanations. Maybe it was the wind, she tried to reason. Maybe an animal. But the rhythm of the steps didn't match anything natural. Slowly, cautiously, she moved toward the window. There, in the dim light, was a figure. Her heart pounded, but she stayed silent, watching carefully. The person didn't knock or speak. They simply paused, as if testing her reaction. Fear tried to take over, but she held herself still, refusing to react impulsively. She realized then that whatever this was, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone had plans, and she was the target. But in that moment, she also felt a flicker of determination. She wouldn't give up her home, her peace, or her routine to fear. She would not be the person they expected her to be. She stayed calm, waited until the figure left, and then checked every lock, every window, every corner. She could feel the tension in her body, but she refused to let it control her. She was alone in the house, yes, but she was not powerless. The next day, she started noticing patterns in the disturbances. Certain times, certain days, and even certain people seemed to appear when she least expected them. She realized that she needed a plan. Not a confrontational one, but one that allowed her to regain control without putting herself in direct danger. She began installing cameras, lights, and motion sensors. She studied the movements in her neighborhood, observed carefully from her windows, and became attentive to details she had previously ignored. Fear was still present, but so was awareness and growing confidence. As the days went by, the intimidations continued, but now she was ready. She never showed fear, never responded angrily, and always remained calm. She learned to predict behaviors, anticipate actions, and prepare quietly. She realized that being alone didn't mean being helpless. She had the right to her space, her home, and her peace, and she would defend it in her own way, silently and carefully. During these moments of tension, she also started to think about the idea of support. She reached out discreetly to a few trusted friends, asking for advice on security measures, on how to handle neighborhood conflict without confrontation, and on ways to remain calm under pressure. She wanted to be smart, not reactive. She learned to trust her instincts, to recognize subtle signals, and to use observation as a tool. Slowly, she felt a shift. She was no longer just a quiet, easy target. She was alert, aware, capable of handling unexpected situations. The night sky no longer felt oppressive, though she stayed vigilant. Each small victory, like noticing a potential threat before it escalated, or catching someone in the act of intimidation without panic, strengthened her resolve. She understood that fear could be managed with patience, attention, and strategy. She was building inner strength, quietly preparing for the moment when the intimidation would have to be confronted. And she would not be alone. And she wasn't, unknown to her neighbors or the people trying to scare her. She had a guest now, a presence she hadn't revealed yet. Someone who observed with her, someone who would eventually change everything. But for now, the evening sounds, the shadows on the walls, and the whispers outside continued, setting the stage for a turning point that no one could predict. She sat in the living room, heart steady, mind alert, quietly acknowledging that she was no longer as vulnerable as they thought, and that soon, the rules of fear were going to change in ways they would never see coming. The days following the first serious scare were tense. She moved through her house carefully, checking doors and windows multiple times a day. Every small sound made her heart jump, but she forced herself to breathe calmly and keep going. She had learned in the previous week that showing panic only made the situation worse. The quiet presence of her guest was reassuring, even though she hadn't yet shared much about him with anyone. He was calm, observant, and seemed to understand things she could not see herself. He would watch from the corner, noting patterns in behavior. And sometimes he would quietly whisper advice that helped her remain steady. The people trying to scare her were persistent. They started leaving small things on her porch, random trash, misplaced objects, and notes with cryptic words that hinted they were watching. At first, she felt her anxiety rise. It was unsettling to see such brazen behavior. But she remembered the advice her guest had given: never show that you are rattled, never respond, and observe everything. She began writing everything down in a notebook, keeping track of dates, times, and details. Patterns began to emerge. Certain individuals would appear at specific times, Others would linger in the shadows, watching her. It became clear that they were coordinating, trying to make her feel isolated and powerless. Her awareness of the neighborhood grew. She started noticing people she had never seen before, cars parked too long and movements that didn't fit normal routines. She learned to watch from inside her home, using reflections in windows and shadows to gauge who was outside without exposing herself. It wasn't just about fear anymore, it was strategy. She realized she needed to take control, not by confrontation, but by knowledge and preparedness. Every piece of information she gathered felt like a small victory, a way to regain some power in an uncomfortable situation. One afternoon, while watering the garden, she noticed a group of people across the street whispering and glancing her way. They smiled in a way that didn't feel friendly. Her guest was with her, sitting quietly on the porch. He whispered calmly, suggesting she remain calm and make note of their actions. He explained that fear could make them bold, but confidence would make them uncertain. She nodded silently, trying to focus on her breathing and the rhythm of her daily tasks. She went about her work, filling the flower beds and trimming small bushes. But her eyes occasionally flicked toward the group, noting their numbers, clothing, and movements. Evening came and the group had dispersed, leaving her feeling a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. She and her guest checked the perimeter of the property, ensuring that nothing had been tampered with. They installed small cameras near doors and along the paths leading to the house. It was a quiet, methodical process, and she began to feel a small sense of empowerment. The guest reminded her that preparation was a form of control, and control reduced fear. She agreed, finding comfort in the careful steps she was taking. That night, the tension returned. She could hear sounds outside: footsteps, the faint shuffle of leaves, and the distant hum of engines. Her guest remained calm, guiding her to observe without reacting. They sat together quietly, listening and noting patterns. She realized that what she feared most, the unknown, was slowly becoming known. Every sound, movement, and shadow had a story. Fear began to feel less like a powerful enemy and more like a challenge that could be understood. Over the next few days, she started to see small changes in her own demeanor. She walked more confidently to the mailbox, greeted neighbors with a calm smile, and continued her routines with purpose. The intimidation tactics still happened, but she noticed that her reactions were no longer instinctively fearful. Her guest explained that people who rely on fear to control others are often discouraged when their tactics fail. Confidence and calm can quietly turn the tables without confrontation. One afternoon, as she organized her kitchen, a note appeared on the counter. The words were vague, but implied that someone was trying to unsettle her again. She didn't panic. Instead, she calmly photographed the note, added it to her record, and left it where it was. Later, they would review everything together. Her guest explained that evidence was power. By documenting these incidents, she was building a clear picture of what was happening and who was involved. She began to understand that knowledge was a protective shield, stronger than any lock on a door. The next night, a loud noise startled her. Something heavy had been thrown against the side of the house. She froze, heart racing, but her guest remained steady. They approached the sound together, carefully examining the area. Nothing was missing or broken, but the message was clear. They were testing boundaries. She didn't respond with anger or fear. She simply noted the event and made minor adjustments to security measures. Each incident that could have caused panic now felt like a lesson, a way to refine her understanding and strategy. She began to notice that some neighbors, previously silent, were watching her response with curiosity. Her calmness and quiet determination created an aura of strength that she hadn't anticipated. It was subtle, but she could sense that those who tried to intimidate her were starting to hesitate. Confidence had a way of changing perception, even before action was taken. Her guest reminded her that the presence of fearlessness was often enough to make bullies reconsider their approach, as days turned into weeks. Her routine solidified. She had a rhythm: observation in the morning, work in the afternoon, review and planning in the evening. The small notebook became a detailed journal of incidents, patterns, and thoughts. She realized that documenting not only helped track threats, but also gave her a sense of purpose. She was no longer just a passive target. She was actively understanding and preparing, quietly reclaiming control. One evening, she decided to test her observations. She intentionally left a small, harmless item outside and observed from inside. Within a short time, she saw a figure approach, pick up the item, and leave a mark on the porch. She documented everything, noting clothing, movement, and timing. The act was small, almost trivial. But it confirmed her suspicions. The intimidation was deliberate, and people were paying attention. She felt a strange satisfaction not from the disturbance itself, but from knowing she could learn from it and anticipate future actions. Her confidence grew steadily. She began walking around the property at night, checking paths, lighting, and hidden corners. Each visit reinforced her understanding and ability to handle potential threats. Fear was still present, a natural response to danger, but it no longer controlled her life. She realized that the real power lay in preparation, awareness, and calm determination. Her guest reinforced this idea, quietly supporting her, offering advice, observing patterns she might have missed. The intimidation tactics continued, but their effectiveness diminished. She could sense hesitation, uncertainty, and even frustration from those attempting to scare her. It was a slow process, but her steady approach was working. She began to feel a sense of empowerment that was both surprising and comforting. She was no longer just surviving. She was actively managing the situation, quietly asserting control without confrontation. During this time, she also began to reflect on the importance of presence and support. Even though her guest remained largely in the background, his guidance and calm demeanor were invaluable. She realized that she didn't need to face fear alone. Support could be subtle, quiet, and still immensely powerful. The combination of her observation skills, careful documentation, and his steady presence created a strategy that was effective without being aggressive. The turning point came one evening when a group appeared outside, attempting the same intimidation as before. She was ready. She didn't react with fear. She observed, documented, and allowed her guests to quietly signal adjustments. The group hesitated, unsure of her response. They were confronted not with anger or retaliation, but with calm observation and preparedness. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was clear that the balance of power was changing. From that point on, the dynamics of intimidation began to shift. The neighborhood, once a source of subtle threats, became a stage for her quiet resilience. She continued her routines, maintained vigilance, and refined her strategies. Fear was no longer the dominant force in her life. Instead, awareness, calm, and careful planning created a sense of empowerment. She understood that true strength often comes from patience, preparation, and quiet determination. Through these experiences, she also began to see the importance of mindset. She reminded herself daily that fear could be managed, threats could be understood, and control could be quietly reclaimed. Each incident became a lesson, each observation a tool, and each day a chance to strengthen her resolve. She realized that living with awareness didn't mean living in fear. It meant living strategically, intelligently, with quiet confidence. By the end of the second week, she was no longer just reacting to intimidation. She was anticipating it, understanding it, and managing it. Her guest remained a silent guide, offering wisdom and calm reassurance. Together, they created an environment where fear lost its power and quiet strength became visible, even if only to those willing to look closely. The stage was set for a shift in the balance of power, one that would change the neighborhood's perception forever, and show that courage and calm determination could quietly turn the tables in ways no one expected. The days that followed were a careful balance between vigilance and normal life. She continued her routines, going to the store, tending to her home, and managing small tasks with her usual diligence. The difference was that every step she took was now paired with awareness. She noticed things she had once overlooked: footsteps that didn't belong, shadows that moved unusually, and cars that appeared at odd hours. Her guests remained quietly observant, providing subtle guidance that helped her stay calm and focused. It became clear that those trying to intimidate her were growing bolder. They started leaving more obvious signs of their presence, from misplaced items to intentionally loud noises near the property. She didn't react with fear. Instead, she documented everything meticulously, noting the time, type of action, and any possible observers. Her guest helped her analyze the patterns, pointing out behaviors she might have missed. They began to form a quiet strategy, not to confront openly, but to understand, predict, and ultimately neutralize the intimidation. One afternoon, she noticed a figure standing across the street, watching her closely. The person didn't approach or speak, but their eyes followed her as she moved around her garden. Her heart raced briefly, but she forced herself to remain calm. She moved slowly and naturally, as if unaware, all the while making mental notes. Her guest whispered advice from a safe distance, suggesting she observe carefully, noting posture, clothing, and any other details that could help identify the person. They kept silent, creating a record without drawing attention. That evening, she reviewed her notes and realized something important. The individuals attempting to scare her were following predictable routines. Certain times of day, certain locations, and even certain actions were consistent. This knowledge shifted the dynamic. Fear was no longer an uncontrollable force, it was something she could anticipate. By understanding patterns, she regained a sense of control that had been missing since the first incidents. The small victories built her confidence. She began leaving subtle signals around her property that allowed her to confirm whether someone was approaching or monitoring her. Simple things like rearranged objects, reflective surfaces, and subtle lights helped her understand movements outside her home without being seen. Each observation, each discovery, strengthened her resolve. She was no longer a passive observer of her own fear. She was actively managing it, quietly reclaiming her space. Her guest became an invaluable partner. He didn't speak loudly or take dramatic action, but his presence was reassuring. He pointed out overlooked details, suggested minor adjustments, and reminded her to remain calm under pressure. The partnership was silent but effective. She realized that support didn't always need to be obvious or confrontational. Sometimes, the quiet presence of someone capable and observant was more powerful than any visible defense. One night, she heard noises again outside her home. This time, she felt a surge of confidence instead of panic. She watched from a safe distance and noticed a small group lingering near the street, clearly waiting for her reaction. She did not give it. She moved calmly inside, pretending to continue her evening routine as if nothing was happening. Her guest whispered a reminder to document everything, which she did, noting clothing, posture, and timing. The group eventually left uncertain because their usual effect fear was missing. The next day, she felt a shift in the air around her. Those attempting to intimidate her seemed less bold. She noticed glances from neighbors, moments of hesitation, and a subtle decrease in confrontational behavior. Her quiet confidence had changed the perception of the neighborhood. People who had assumed she was an easy target were beginning to see that she was far from vulnerable. Every small, controlled action reinforced that image. Even without words or overt confrontation, she also noticed that her own sense of self was changing. The constant observation and careful documentation honed her awareness. She began to notice small details about people's behavior that she had once ignored, the way someone shifted their weight, the hesitation before they spoke, the small cues that revealed intention. These skills gave her an edge she hadn't realized she could develop. Fear was no longer her guide. Awareness was. Her guests suggested subtle strategies to maintain her safety and sanity. They discussed routines, observation techniques, and ways to remain calm under pressure. Each suggestion was simple but effective. A reflective surface to see behind her, a light that could be adjusted to signal movement, or a small object placed strategically to confirm presence. The combination of her observation, documentation, and his guidance created a powerful system of awareness that allowed her to live without constant panic. One evening, a more direct attempt occurred. Someone tried to create a scene by banging on the gate and leaving a note implying threats. She did not react impulsively. Instead, she observed quietly, noted every detail, and later analyzed it with her guest. They identified patterns and possible perpetrators. She realized that confrontation wasn't necessary. By understanding, documenting, and preparing, she could neutralize intimidation without escalation. As the week progressed, her confidence and calm demeanor continued to affect those around her. People who had once assumed she was an easy target were now uncertain. Even those attempting to scare her hesitated, unsure of how she might respond. Her quiet strength had become evident. She walked through her neighborhood with a calm presence, aware but unshakable. Each step reinforced her resolve, each observation reinforced her understanding, and each day brought more clarity about the behavior she was facing. She began experimenting with controlled observations. She left small harmless objects in specific locations and watched reactions. These actions were subtle, yet informative, providing clues about who was monitoring her and how they operated. The process became a form of empowerment. She realized that knowledge, patience, and calmness could shift dynamics more effectively than fear or aggression. The guest reminded her constantly that subtlety was key. No overt confrontation was necessary. Observation and understanding were enough to change the power balance. Through these experiences, she learned to read people in ways she hadn't before. A slight hesitation, a glance, or a movement became meaningful signals. She began to anticipate actions before they occurred. Fear still existed, but it was now paired with strategy. Each incident was an opportunity to learn, adapt, and regain control. She felt her power grow quietly internally, without needing to show it to anyone else. The intimidation tactics gradually became less effective. Those attempting to create fear sensed the shift. Their actions lacked the same confidence they once displayed. She had remained calm and observant, and in doing so, she had changed the rules of engagement. The neighborhood, once a stage for subtle threats, had become a field where her quiet strength dominated. She also began to notice the psychological impact of her calm approach. The hesitation and uncertainty from those trying to intimidate her were evidence that fear was no longer a tool they could rely on. Her presence, calm and measured, had disrupted their expectations. She realized that courage often works silently. It doesn't need to be loud or confrontational to be powerful. The subtle power of awareness and preparedness had shifted the balance. Her guest continued to be a quiet guide. He didn't intervene unless necessary, but his observations helped her refine her strategies. He encouraged patience, focus, and deliberate action. Together, they maintained vigilance without letting fear dominate their lives. This partnership, though largely invisible to others, became a cornerstone of her quiet empowerment. By the end of this period, she had transformed. She was no longer the quiet, nervous newcomer. She had developed keen observation skills, a systematic approach to potential threats, and the quiet confidence that comes from preparation and awareness. Fear existed, but was manageable. Intimidation lost its power. She understood the dynamics of her neighborhood, the behaviors of those who tried to scare her, and the strength that comes from patience and calm determination. Her life continued with small routines, careful observation, and the quiet support of her guest. Every day was a balance between normalcy and vigilance. Every night was an opportunity to refine strategies and understand behavior. She had learned that strength often comes silently, that awareness can protect more effectively than aggression, and that calm, steady confidence can quietly turn the tables on fear. She had changed the rules of her own life, creating a safe space where intimidation could no longer dominate. The stage was set for further developments, and she knew that, with careful observation and quiet strategy, the final shift in power was approaching. The tension that had built over the past weeks reached a new level. The people attempting to intimidate her seemed frustrated, their movements more deliberate, almost desperate. They were testing boundaries more aggressively, leaving notes with stronger language, banging on fences, and trying to startle her with noises in the middle of the night. She had prepared herself for such escalation. With her guests by her side, she faced each incident calmly, analyzing patterns, noting behaviors, and refining her response. The key was patience. The more they tried, the the clearer the picture became of who they were and what they hoped to achieve. One evening, she heard footsteps approaching the front of her home. The sound was deliberate and forceful, unlike the smaller noises that had occurred before. She and her guest observed from inside, taking note of the shadows and movements. The figure paused, seemingly waiting for her reaction. She remained calm, continued her routine, as if nothing unusual were happening, and mentally documented the details. Her guest whispered that sometimes not reacting was more powerful than any confrontation. She understood that instinctively. But practicing it in the moment was a challenge she had now mastered. Over the next few days, she noticed subtle changes in the behavior of those trying to intimidate her. They hesitated more often, their actions slower and less confident. It was clear that her calm, steady approach was having an effect. The guest explained that consistency was key. By not giving in to fear and by demonstrating control, she was forcing the aggressors to question themselves. Fear thrives on reaction. Without it, their tactics lost power. Her observation skills grew sharper. She could now detect small gestures, fleeting expressions, and minor changes in behavior that would have gone unnoticed before. Each detail was significant. Who lingered too long near the street? Who glanced nervously at a neighbor while leaving? What vehicles appeared repeatedly at certain times? She recorded everything, creating a detailed mental map of movements, patterns, and intentions. It was methodical, precise, and empowering. One afternoon, she decided to test the situation further. She intentionally left a personal item in an obvious place outside, then observed the reactions from a distance. Within minutes, someone approached, clearly checking the item and noting its placement. She documented the time, appearance, and behavior of the person, then discreetly withdrew. This exercise confirmed what she already suspected. The intimidation was coordinated and deliberate. The knowledge itself felt like a victory, a small but powerful form of control. Evenings became exercises in quiet strategy. She and her guest would review incidents, discuss observations, and plan subtle adjustments to their routines. They would place small objects strategically, adjust lighting, and observe responses. Each adjustment provided new information, which in turn refined their understanding. The guest reminded her that preparation and patience often outweighed confrontation. Calm observation and subtle action were far more effective than any visible defense or reaction. The psychological impact on the aggressors became more apparent. Their confidence faltered. Attempts to startle or intimidate her were met with calm, measured responses. She didn't react impulsively, didn't confront them directly, but she demonstrated awareness, preparedness, and control. The dynamic had shifted. They were no longer the dominant force. Their tactics had lost much of their power. She also began to notice a change within herself. The fear that had once dominated her thoughts now coexisted with confidence and focus. She walked the neighborhood with quiet assurance, aware of her surroundings and capable of managing unexpected incidents. The combination of observation, documentation, and subtle strategy created a new sense of empowerment. She was no longer a passive participant in her own life. She was actively shaping her environment and the responses of those around her. One night, intimidation escalated further. A group appeared outside her property, making loud noises and leaving threatening notes. She observed carefully, noting clothing, movements, and timing. Her guest guided her through the process of calmly documenting everything while avoiding direct engagement. They reviewed the incidents afterward, analyzing behavior, predicting future actions, and refining strategies. She realized that understanding and preparation had become her most powerful tools. Fear could be managed, and control could be quietly reclaimed. Her confidence and composure began to influence the neighborhood. Those who had once assumed she was an easy target started to show hesitation, uncertainty, and respect. The intimidation tactics lost effectiveness because they relied on reaction, and she no longer reacted with fear. Her quiet strength became visible through her calm demeanor and careful observation. The guest reminded her that influence often comes without confrontation, simply through consistency and awareness. She continued to refine her routines, balancing normal daily life with vigilance. Each incident was an opportunity to learn, adapt, and strengthen her strategies. She became adept at predicting behaviors, noticing subtle signals, and managing potential threats. Her quiet approach created an environment where intimidation had little power, and awareness became the defining force. One evening, a more direct attempt was made. Someone approached her gate aggressively, leaving a note implying imminent action. She observed, documented, and maintained composure. The guest guided her through the process, ensuring she remained safe and collected. The aggressor left uncertain, unsure of how she would respond. This incident reinforced her understanding. Knowledge, patience, and calm observation were more powerful than any reactive confrontation. As the weeks progressed, the aggressors became noticeably cautious. Hesitation, slower movements, and uncertainty were signs that their intimidation tactics were failing. She realized that quiet strength and strategic observation could influence behavior far more than fear or aggression. The neighborhood dynamic had shifted. The aggressors were no longer confident. They were aware that their usual tactics were ineffective. Her own sense of self continued to grow. She walked confidently, tended to her home with purpose, and interacted with neighbors calmly. Observation and awareness had become second nature. She understood the importance of documenting incidents, analyzing patterns, and preparing subtly for potential challenges. Each day reinforced her ability to manage fear and maintain control. Her guest remained a constant, quiet presence. His guidance, observations, and calm demeanor provided reassurance and clarity. Together, they had created a system of preparedness that allowed her to live without panic. Even when facing deliberate attempts to intimidate her, this partnership, though subtle, is instrumental in shifting the balance of power. The neighborhood began to recognize the change. Subtle signs of hesitation, careful glances, and slower actions from those who had tried to intimidate her indicated that her calm confidence was effective. Fear no longer controlled interactions. Her quiet strength had become evident. Altering perceptions and dynamics without confrontation, through careful observation, documentation, and strategic preparation, she had transformed her experience. The home that once felt vulnerable now felt secure. Fear existed, but was manageable. Intimidation had lost its power. She had learned that calm, patient, and deliberate action could quietly shift power dynamics. Awareness, understanding, and confidence had become her most powerful tools. By the end of this period, she was no longer the quiet, nervous newcomer. She had developed skills of observation, analysis, and strategic planning. Her presence in the neighborhood was one of calm confidence. Fear had been managed, and control had been reclaimed. The stage was set for a final shift, one that would show clearly that quiet determination, awareness, and strategic patience could outmatch intimidation and fear, and that she, along with her guest, were prepared for the resolution that would finally assert her, strength and protect her space. The final week of the ongoing tension brought a sense of anticipation. She could feel the shift in the neighborhood. The people who had tried to intimidate her were more cautious, uncertain, and hesitant. She and her guest continued their quiet observation, documentation, and analysis of every small detail. Each incident, no matter how minor, provided insight into behavior, patterns, and weaknesses. She had learned to approach fear not as a threat to be faced impulsively, but as a challenge to be understood and managed. One evening, she noticed a group gathered at the corner of her street. They whispered and glanced toward her house. Normally, this would have caused anxiety, but she remained calm. Her guest reminded her to observe without reacting, and she did just that. She noted their clothing, body language, and the timing of their movements. Every detail became part of her growing understanding of how intimidation worked and how to counter it without confrontation. This information would later prove crucial. The group attempted to make themselves more noticeable by banging on fences and leaving more threatening notes. She remained composed, documenting everything and analyzing patterns. Her guest guided her on subtle adjustments to maintain awareness and safety. They placed small objects, adjusted lights, and monitored movement from a distance. The combination of observation, preparation, and calm response slowly eroded the confidence of those attempting to scare her. As the days passed, she realized that her quiet confidence had a noticeable effect. Those who had tried to intimidate her began to hesitate, second-guess their actions, and avoid direct contact. Her presence, calm and deliberate, had shifted the balance of power without confrontation. The guest emphasized the importance of consistency. By maintaining composure and awareness, she forced those trying to scare her to question themselves, their intentions, and their approach. One afternoon, she noticed someone she recognized from previous incidents watching from a distance. Instead of reacting with fear, she continued her routine, pretending to be absorbed in daily tasks. Her guest whispered observations and suggestions for subtle adjustments. She began to understand the psychological impact of her calm approach. Her consistent composure had disrupted the tactics of those attempting intimidation. Their usual methods no longer worked because she no longer provided the expected reaction. The turning point came when a group approached her gate aggressively, leaving notes that implied imminent action. She and her guest observed carefully, documenting clothing, behavior, and timing. They analyzed the situation and predicted possible outcomes. She stayed calm, following the plan they had developed over weeks. By remaining composed, she forced the group to hesitate. Her quiet strength had become evident, and the power dynamic had shifted. Her confidence and composure began to influence the broader neighborhood. Those who had once assumed she was an easy target showed hesitation and respect. Intimidation tactics lost their effectiveness because fear was no longer present. Her quiet strength, observation, and strategic patience became visible through consistent actions. The guest reminded her that influence often came through consistency and subtlety rather than confrontation. She realized that quiet determination could be more powerful than aggression. She continued to refine her routines, balancing normal life with vigilance. Each incident became an opportunity to learn, adapt, and strengthen strategies. She predicted behaviors, noticed subtle signals, and managed potential threats. Observation and documentation became her most effective tools. Awareness replaced fear as the guiding force in her life, allowing her to reclaim control and redefine her environment. One night, a direct challenge occurred. A group attempted to create fear by banging loudly on the fence and leaving an explicit note. She did not react impulsively. She observed, documented, and stayed composed. Her guest guided her through the process of analyzing behavior while maintaining safety. The aggressors eventually left, unsure of how she would respond. This incident confirmed that preparation, awareness, and calm observation were more effective than confrontation or reaction. Her quiet confidence had disrupted the cycle of intimidation. As the days passed, hesitation became more apparent among those who had tried to scare her. Movements were cautious, attempts at intimidation were weaker, and their confidence faltered. She realized that her calm, consistent approach had reshaped the neighborhood dynamic. Fear no longer controlled interactions. Quiet strength and awareness had replaced it. The balance of power had shifted in her favor. Her sense of self grew stronger. She walked confidently, managed her home, and interacted with neighbors calmly. Observation and awareness became second nature. Documenting incidents, analyzing patterns, and preparing subtly were now integral parts of her life. Each day reinforced her ability to manage fear, anticipate actions, and maintain control. She had learned that strength often comes silently and subtly. Through preparation, observation, and consistent calm, her guest remained a constant guide, offering insight, reassurance, and support. Their quiet partnership allowed her to face challenges without panic or confrontation. Through careful observation and strategic preparation, they created a system that maintained her safety and empowered her to live without constant fear. This subtle guidance had been crucial in shifting the balance of power and ensuring that intimidation no longer dictated her life. The neighborhood began to reflect the change. Subtle signs of uncertainty, slower movements, and cautious behavior from those who had attempted intimidation indicated that her approach was effective. Fear was no longer a tool they could rely on. Her quiet strength had created a new dynamic, one where she could live confidently in her home and maintain control of her environment through weeks of careful observation, documentation, and strategic action. She had transformed her experience. Her home, once a place of vulnerability, now felt secure. Fear existed but was manageable. Intimidation had lost its power. She understood that calm, patient, and deliberate action could quietly shift power dynamics. Awareness, preparedness, and confidence had become her most powerful tools. By the final week, she was no longer the nervous newcomer. She had developed keen observation skills, the ability to analyze behavior, and a strategic approach to potential threats. Her presence in the neighborhood was one of calm confidence. Fear had been managed, control had been reclaimed, and the quiet strength she had cultivated influenced those around her. The stage was set for a lasting resolution, proving that careful preparation, strategic observation, and quiet determination could outmatch intimidation and ensure safety and peace.